what I wanted to talk about today is about the so-called arsenal of democracy, which was a term not invented but coined by FDR in one of his famous fireside chats, you may know, in late 1940. He used to do these radio fireside chats, and at one point in late 1940 he said over the radio that he needed America to become the arsenal of democracy, mostly in its own defense. This is, as many of you will know, 1 year prior to the United States entering the war. But what I'm most interested in today is the way in which the working class, but the American population in general, was recruited, enlisted in participating in the war effort, to see themselves as part of the war. And also to focus on the way in which the state coordinated this activity, and to reflect at least somewhat briefly on maybe ways in which we might think of the current conjuncture as a place in which we might bring some of those lessons forward. So as I mentioned, I thought this was interesting. You might be able to see it, but it says, "United we stand," which is an interesting echo from the past, a phrase that was clearly in use long before 9/11. And for those of you unfamiliar, I know it sounds like many of you are, beat the promise referred to productivity promises that you were making to the men on the front. So the idea was that all union workers, or all production workers all over the United States would beat the promise, do better than they promised they would for their soldiers. So this is a really interesting slide because this is the poster from a commemorative celebration of the arsenal of democracy at the NRA headquarters in DC, the National Rifle Association. The arsenal of democracy represented the triumph of freedom, as many of you will know. So this here is indicative of the attempt on the part of the American state, in collaboration with capital, to enlist workers in the war movement. And so here we have, give them both barrels. So we have the riveter and the machine gunner, both involved in the war effort. This is an attempt to bring workers in to understand themselves as actually soldiers on the home front. Probably you've all seen a lot of images like this. The buy war bonds, keep him flying, caught up in a kind of nationalist war movement. Workers were expected and hoped to take every spare penny, put it into war bonds, put it into the war effort. But what I also want to point out here is that while it was kind of ham-fisted and heavy-handed the way in which the state kind of organized this propaganda, I almost went over there, didn't I? And organized this propaganda. There are ways in which workers became ideologically enlisted, like felt themselves as part of it, that weren't merely just sort of being suckers to the state message, right? There's a call to an egalitarian democracy that was here, that workers grabbed a hold of. So here it says, industry, the arsenal of democracy. And then down here it says, defense in the field begins in the factory. I have a whole series of these. They're excellent. And right here, there's a guy saying, it all depends upon me. Really personalizing this battle. But again, I really want to emphasize the extent to which this happens partly because of coercion on the part of the state, but also from consent from workers. Like, there is a real collaboration here that is not at all even and not at all untroubled, but is still nonetheless like, this is ideology at work. This is people believing they're doing the right thing. And I'm not saying they weren't, but there's a real concept of common cause here for some people. This is the ideology of shared sacrifice. We all got to do our part. So here it is again, the arsenal of democracy. The call to defense is a call to us all. And then some sort of strange poem at the bottom. Here's another one, the arsenal of democracy. Defense of our liberty begins in the factory. And here we have, this is an interesting image. I'm sorry I couldn't blow it up. It says, it all depends on you and me. And this is another one of those instances. We have the guy in the tie shaking hands with the guy in the hat. The labor and capital shaking hands. But at the same time, I wanted to flag too that just like today, the war effort is entirely premised on the notion of defense. Like, all of this is defense. None of it is offense. We're never on the offensive. We are on the defensive. And I would actually say that the power of this defensive posture on the part of the United States, they're always under siege. They must always defend themselves from the threat to liberty, the threat to American values, is a posture that really, really carries a lot of weight today and finds much of its power from this kind of message. the impression here is always that the United States is under attack, and that the defensiveness of every aggression is what persists. And I think that, if nothing else, it's worth noting that this is different than basically every other empire in history. Right? The Roman Empire did not say they were on the defense. The Spanish colonial powers did not say they were on the defense. The Ottoman Empire was not on the defense. They wanted stuff and people and land and materials. But the American Empire is growing on the defense. And this is a really powerful message that still persists today, I think, one that we need to really think about. If we think of this more symbolically as the marriage of the American nation and business, then this is really kind of powerful. Beat the promise, you know, like, yeah, we're in it together. So here we have, this is a poster of a guy, he's at work, you're supposed to know that, because this poster is up on work walls, say at a factory. And he's thinking about his lady. And down here it says, losing time suits them fine. And we have Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler. You're our pal for being lazy at work, or for being distracted at work. And these kinds of messages were everywhere during the war. Workplaces were filled with these things. And what it says is not that lack of productivity or lack of participation is a failure or a weakness. It's an act of treason. You know? This guy is a traitor, at least at this moment. And what's interesting about part of the war machine's message was that the extent to which workers were portrayed as a bunch of potentially backstabbing, lazy, rumor-mongering traitors. And that they had to constantly monitor themselves. So I think this is actually an important difference from today in some senses, because today, if we look at the American ideological mobilization that happened around the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, we find ourselves in a situation where I think to some extent people are told to support the troops, to believe in the cause, and to keep doing what they're doing, which in this case is shopping. Right? But here, the worker is a soldier, like fighting the war. And the war is against not just an enemy in Germany and in Japan and in Italy and in other parts of the world. The enemy is internal. And not just internal to the United States, but internal to each of us. We each have the capacity to be a traitor. We must monitor ourselves personally to keep that at bay. So there's an enemy inside all of us that the arsenal of democracy is trying to squash, and it's our job to squash it. And I think that another thing to bring up here, to some extent, is the extent to which this is no longer part of the ideological baggage and propaganda that's thrown at us is to some extent really indicative of where we are on the left today. Because the enemy inside of them, the enemy inside of the worker here is really his or her lefty part, his or her labor part, right? The enemy that the workers were supposed to suppress is the person who would resist, who would ask a question. And the fact that we're not told to suppress that person right now is because that person's not acting up enough. The fact that they don't have to mention this to us anymore is a scary thought, I think. And then this is fantastic right here. 6 ways to win this war. Oh, I can't read it very well. But the third one is be confident and cheerful. There you go. So I'm just getting to the end here. So this is a more recent messing with some older things. It says, attack, attack Iraq. Another war will surely pull us out of recession. It's a joke. It's an excellent joke. There's a whole series of them. Some of the lessons we might learn from the war experience and the attempt to enlist and get the economy going and convince people of a cause are, clearly lessons we maybe don't want to learn or don't want to bring back. Here's another one. This is what's important. Real Americans want jobs, not civil liberties. And to some extent, I also think that we have a lesson here to learn when we face something like climate change. If we can recognize in the system a possibility for what it can be in the long term, then climate change, one of the only good things about climate change is that it presents an opportunity for such radical political economic restructuring that the world that we remake in the face of climate change can be other than the one that we have. And that's about the only good thing I think we can make of climate change right now. But it's also one of the few lessons, really hopeful lessons, I think, that we can bring out of this experience here.